Hello, and welcome to Ensemble Conversations with me, Mark Kilmurray. It's my great pleasure to welcome actor-director John Bell to talk to us this morning. Hi, John, how are you?
Hi there, Mark.
How are things with you?
Oh, look, where do I start?
Yes.
Everybody in this dreadful time, we're all just coasting along, getting through it day by day, keeping ourselves motivated. I'm spending quite a bit of time reaching out and ringing up friends and writing and emailing people to stay in touch. I think that's really important. And whenever I'm not doing that, I'm listening to ABC Classic FM, which is my favorite radio station. And they play very soothing and inspiring, great music all day long. So that's another thing that's keeping me sane. So,
Yeah.
one just has to keep oneself fairly busy and looking ahead and hoping for the good times to roll again. I have managed to write a book, which is made good use of the time,
Wow.
and preparing a number of shows for next year, recital programs, etc., when we get the green light.
And the book, John, can you say anything about that?
Yes, it's with the publisher right now, going through the editorial process.
Hmm.
Its title is Some Achieve Greatness, and its subtitle is Lessons from Shakespeare on Leadership. So I've taken a number of Shakespeare's major characters and examined what sort of leaders they were, good or bad, their successes, their failures, their faults, and their talents, as a model for leadership today. Not necessarily in politics or the corporate world, but in also day-to-day dealings. In all our opportunities to show leadership. So that's been a rather fascinating experience to research those characters in depth.
Yes, absolutely. I don't think I'd like to follow Falstaff into anything particularly.
It come to a pretty sticky end, but not as bad as Richard III, as you well know.
Yes, that would be interesting as well. And we have a few of those around at the moment, perhaps.
What do you mean, Richard III's or Falstaff?
Both.
Well, I think this latest crisis has brought out some of the best things in leadership, certainly in Australia, and some of the worst in the United States and Brazil and some other places. We've seen some catastrophic failures of leadership there. And I think here we can be very, very, very reassured the leadership we've seen in Australia and the response to that leadership.
Yes, I agree, absolutely. What a great subject. Where did that idea come from, John? What was that? What was the thinking behind Shakespeare, as in the leadership of the characters to today?
Well, as you know, when you're putting on a play with your subscriber audience, you give a pre-show talk and talk about the play and the character and so on. And so I've done a fair bit of that over the years at Bell Shakespeare. And people heard me talking about those issues at those kind of briefings and said, would you come and talk at a few corporate dinners about leadership and Shakespeare? And I'd done a bit of that. And then a publisher was there one night and picked it up and said, look, would you like to publish that? Could I commission you to write a book on that subject? So it grew from, those pre-show chats into something rather more large scale.
Fabulous. And when can we see that in the shops?
Well, given the one's talent for predicting these things, they say early next year is what we're heading for.
Fantastic. That's a phrase we use. We're hearing a lot, isn't it? Early next year seems to cover
Yes,
everything.
that's right. Yeah. Or early next year after. Who knows?
Yeah, all of humanity early next year.
Yeah.
John, where did your love? You have a love of language, and particularly Shakespeare, but also poetry, as we saw recently with your shows, much cherished and loved, reciting favourite poems. I'm just interested where this developed. Was this something as a child, as a boy, that you loved, or was it something that went along as you went along into your acting career?
Well, I guess as with so many people who ask that question, so often the answer is I had this wonderful teacher. And I was lucky having two wonderful teachers when I was in junior high school. When I was 13, I remember we had our English teacher came in and chucked down a copy of Midsummer Night's Dream on each desk and said, open up your copies of Shakespeare. But instead of getting us to read it around the class, as they so often did in those days, which was a deadly way of approaching Shakespeare, he acted out the whole play for us, marching up and down the aisles, declaiming all the lines, playing all the characters. He was a great big bloke with a big voice. He was the football coach as well as the English teacher. It was a terrific bottom. That was his favourite role. His Titania, Queen of the Fairies, was a little less convincing. But described the sets, the costumes, the lighting, the pratfalls, the music, the gags, and he performed the whole play for us, made it come to life. And we couldn't wait for the next English lesson. And then he would march us off to the movies to see Olivia's Richard III, Hamlet, Henry V. And so at the age of 15, I remember saying very definitely, I'm going to be an actor and do Shakespeare for the rest of my life. And that's what I'd more or less done.
Yes.
He hooked me. And then I was very fortunate having a teacher came along a few years after that in my senior high school. And he was also a great lover of theatre and Shakespeare. And so he assisted me in putting on the one and only play night in the school's history. And he said, you can direct the play, you can choose your roles, you can do, it's your night. So I had made a modest bill of Oedipus Rex and my favourite scenes from Henry IV and a pantomime in which I was the chief clown. So I got away with murder, but I'm eternally grateful to those two teachers. And I only realised in later life, one never thanks them enough. You take it for granted that they're there to do what you, to look after you and give you opportunities. And I thought, my gosh, the pains those men went to inculcate that in me. I wish they were still here now. I could say a million thank yous that I didn't say then.
Yes, indeed, because that changed your life. That took you into
Totally.
direction.
Absolutely, set my life's course. Absolutely.
Yes, and those teachers are very precious. I had a couple of teachers. One was an English teacher who used to wear a long scarf like Tom Baker in Doctor Who in the 70s, and in the lunchtime said, come and have a chat with your teacher, with a whole bunch of us. And some of the kids he was saying that to were the hard cases, as we always said. And we'd go around the football fields and he'd be quoting poetry and talking about English, and it was, like you say, it became like a drug because he made it so interesting. You wanted to be with him, but you also wanted to hear what he was going to say, which then and plants that seed. Yeah, indeed.
Well, that's, I guess, one reason when I started Bell Shakespeare, I was so determined to have an education wing attached to the company. We weren't just performing plays; we were taking them into the classrooms and talking to the kids and, critiquing the scenes with the kids participating. So that's still operating. I've left Bell Shakespeare 5 years ago now, but the company's still going and that education work is still continuing. And I think that's so necessary because, kids resist anything that's thrust upon them and that is good for them. And you've got to sort of seduce them into participating and enjoying poetry and literature and Shakespeare. You can't just sort of say, there's King Lear, enjoy. You've got to tell them how and teach them how to enjoy.
Yes, and personally how that can change your life, which is it's so important.
Yeah.
John, also you were co-founder of the Nimrod Theatre Company in Sydney and was a champion of new Australian work, particularly discovering and producing David Williamson's work, which became that Australian voice among many other writers. But at the time, that seemed to be very important. Was that an important thing for you to say, this is something we need to do?
Yes, I came back from England in 1970 and I was teaching at NIDA for a year. I was head of acting there, but I wasn't really cut out for teaching at that stage. I didn't know enough to start with. Right. And my friend Ken Haller, the late Ken Haller, said, would you join me in starting a theatre company? So I, threw caution to the winds. We found that old stables in Nimrod Street in King's Cross and converted that into a theatre. And the intention was to perform new Australian work, but also my own particular thing, let's take some classics as well and do those in an Australian way. In other words, not to make them like Dad and Dave, but let's use our own voices, let's put them in contemporary costume, let's examine the issues that make these plays ours and not some foreign artefact. So new plays, new voices, plus revitalising or revisiting the classics was always the agenda for the Nimrod. After 3 years there, we'd outgrown the space, so we took over the old factory in Belvoir Street, Surrey Hills, and turned that into what is now the Belvoir Theatre. So I ran that company with Ken and other people for 14 years. And yes, David Williamson was one of the keys to our success. There were other writers as well doing very well, Jack Hibbard and John Romerell and others. But David hit a particular note. He caught the Australian vernacular in a way that the others didn't quite. They were a bit more poetic or a bit intellectual, you might say. David's approach was very much, this is us, this is how we sound, this is the ugly Australian of today. And the places like the Club and Don's Party and the Removalists, they really took off, and I think not only revitalised our theatre, but revitalised our film and television industry, because they were very much lacking in that kind of material. And once Williamson, caught the public's attention, that had a terrific knock-on effect for Australian writers and script writers and film producers as well. So I think the ripples from David's plays are still spreading and spreading wide.
The 1970s film output towards the end of the 70s into the 80s was amazing. Australian film that I remember seeing when I was in the UK and thinking, this is just wonderful. And like you said, there was a reality to it, and there was an Australian voice that was coming through that was a revelation.
Mm. I think now, of course, that Australian voice is still necessary. We still have to be very, militant about projecting ourselves to the rest of the world and telling our own stories to ourselves, celebrating our own culture. But now, of course, there's more than one middle-class white man's voice. We have now to hear many other Australian voices and give them a chance, from Indigenous writers to all the other people who've since come to this country and have their stories to tell, and they are now integrated into Australia. And their stories have to become our stories as well. We have to understand them and where they're coming from and share the joy of their cultures with them. So now it's a much more diverse palette, and many, many voices need to be heard and will be, need to be celebrated.
Absolutely. Reflecting the Australia now on our stages is very important. Absolutely. Yeah. In 1990, you founded the Bell Shakespeare Company. Again, that had that Australian voice within Shakespeare, which I found really fascinating when I first came here. And that, I guess, was one of your ideas behind Bell Shakespeare. As much as producing and performing Shakespeare plays, there was also that idea of taking that into the Australian stage.
Yes, I worked for 5 years with the Royal Shakespeare Company, and it was a wonderful time. That's when I really learned what acting was all about, just standing in the wings and watching every night. People like Paul Schofield was my very favourite icon at that time. And people like Ian Richardson, Ian Holm, the late Sir Ian Holm, yes. Judi Dench, Helen Mirren, all those people, that bunch of actors and directors, Peter Hall, Peter Brook, John Barton. It was a wonderful time to be in that company, and I learnt so much. But when I came back in 1970 and saw what Australia was like, I thought, that doesn't apply here. I just can't bring that back and try and do what I've been doing all those 5 years in England. We've got to find a new way of doing Shakespeare for now and here. And okay, at the start we were doing pretty broad Aussie accents and, the Kubras and Boyangs and all that, and trying to sort of localise it, which is, a start. But now it's become absolutely totally accepted that you wouldn't do Shakespeare any other way, except in our own voices, our own accents, of course.
Yes.
And things like colour-blind casting, gender-blind casting, all those things have followed on, so that we are now restating Shakespeare in our terms and examining him, having a conversation with Shakespeare about what these plays are really about, what are the issues, what do they mean to us today? Because in a sense, the plays are never finished. They're open-ended. Someone like Brecht or Shaw would have given you an answer and said, that's the solution. Shakespeare doesn't. He leaves it up in the air, and they're ambivalent, they're ambiguous, and we have to find our own solution to these great moral questions and problems and situations. So in that sense, the plays are always for us to inhabit and to finish off. The questions are there, the answers we have to supply. The text is not the play, the text is the text. The play is what happens when you pick it up and start acting it. And there was always different every time it goes on stage.
And it also means you can revisit the same play and revisit the same character, because there's so much still to discover and to reinvent. I'm interested in, you've played Richard III more than once, and every time you approached it, did you approach it completely fresh, or did you think, okay, last time I did this and this time I won't, or how would you make that, how do you make that work? Particularly, I suppose, working with another director who would have a different approach.
Yes, it was different every time, partly because I saw new things in it, partly because the director had a different concept. So I guess the essentials of the character stayed the same, but in terms of subtlety and finessing and psychological analysis, it did grow. I was particularly interested the last time I did it, to do a bit more kind of medical research into Richard's condition and what that would do to you psychologically. So, he's not just a villain because he is deformed. The two things are quite separate, but he uses the one to excuse the other, if you like. So there's a lot more psychology to be got out of Richard III, even though he's a very early character in Shakespeare. He's not as profound as, say, Hamlet or Macbeth or Lear, but it's still a great exercise in character creation, and of course a gift for any actor, as you would appreciate. So each time I did it, I think the last time I was the happiest, there was a production Michael Gow did, and that was quite intensely realistic. It was set in sort of Hogarth's London, a sort of 18th century very slummy kind of grubby kind of London, and it really worked terribly well. The two earlier times I'd been a bit more fancy and gone out on a more abstract limb. So the second production I did, and then the first production I did, we took on animal shapes, and we had like furs and almost like claws, and every character had an animal to inhabit, which was great fun and very sort of colourful and histrionic. But I think it was didn't get into the psychological depth and reality of the relationships as I did with the certainly the third production I did of it. But see, Hamlet's another play that goes on. It changes as you change. You can measure your life against Hamlet. You should play it every 10 years just to catch up on where am I on my own life journey. Because when you're 20 and say, to die, a chance to dream, death, the country from which no traveller returns, it means something. When you're 40 or 60 or getting on to 80, it means something much different, much more profound and much more personal. So you identify very, very fully. I'm fascinated to see that Ian McKellen's going to play Hamlet again at 80. It's kind of a waving the banner for against ageism, I suppose. Christ knows how old Gertrude will be. She had to be 100.
That's right. That's fascinating, isn't it? I think one of the elderly Hamlets was 72, but they were in the days when there was makeup and prosthetics and you saw it from a distance. But that would be fascinating to see at 80. It gives everybody hope, I think.
It certainly does.
I remember when I did it, I think I was 41, and I was so self-conscious about being 41. I dyed my hair, but you sort of got away with it. But as you say, the older you are, the better. Now I'll say those lines to myself occasionally and think, oh, yes, that's what he's talking about.
That's right. It digs deeper. So Shakespeare's really unfair in a way because he put such a load on you as an actor, and you can't ever live up to it. To think that Juliet is 14, but no 14-year-old actor or actress can get into the full depth of Juliet. It's charming to see a young person play it. But, my God, the life experience you need, the things you have to have gone through to appreciate what Juliet has gone through and how she matures over the length of 3 hours to a very strong woman from a callow teenager. It's a fantastic journey. Yeah. So, in a way, I think Shakespeare must have had fantastic actors because you don't write parts as good as that for people who can't play them. He keeps raising the bar. He must have had fantastic actors and boy actors who could play roles like Juliet and Ophelia. They must have been amazing, I think.
Yes, and I think you said about the earlier play of Richard III. I felt when I had a stab at it, so to speak, that it didn't carry you as well as, say, Hamlet did later on, because Hamlet, he seems to carry you as an actor better than Richard III. Richard III felt more, for me anyway, more of an effort than Hamlet. You could sort of, after the previews and the opening and you're into it a few weeks, you could ride the tide of Shakespeare's writing easier, as it were.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. I think Richard's more of a show pony as a role. You can still make it very intensely real and so on, but the journey is not as great as Hamlet's. Is a profound journey. He goes through a whole lifetime of experiencing that 3 hours on stage. And the more you read it and think about it and play it, the more you get out of it.
Absolutely. Now you published a book on Shakespeare in 2011. Your reminiscences of playing Shakespeare the more than 50 years. How interesting was that to go back and think about all those past productions?
Well, you know, I don't do that for some reason. I keep thinking I must look back on that and have a think about it, look at those old photos, and they're still sitting there, and I've never actually gone back to it. I might one day, but somehow once you've done it, it's done, and it takes a lot to get you to go back and look at it all again. It's like photograph albums. We say that's the one thing I would save from the fire if the house burned down. But when did you last look through a photograph album? You know it's there, and all those pictures are there, but you never sit down as you intended to by the fire one night and have a look at them and reminisce. It just life's too busy, I guess.
Absolutely, I know. I thought that absolutely the other day. I was looking at photos. I thought I never look at those. But for your book on reminiscences, you would have had to have gone back
Oh
and
yes.
yeah, and looked at those past productions. How do you choose what to write about? Is it just that it's the history, or is it something your personal favourite that appeared in the book? How did you sort that out into writing about it?
I guess it was pretty selective. I just chose the themes and the ideas I wanted to pursue. I didn't go through all the day-to-day business and all the propriety of the company or any of that kind of stuff. I just sort of concentrated on the major roles, major characters, themes that emerged to me as being important. So it's by no means a history of the Nimrod or the Bell Shakespeare Company. Probably some academic person can do all that in years to come, if anybody's interested.
Yes.
But for me, it was just really more of a personal journey on what I experienced in taking on those directorial or acting roles.
In choosing roles now, John, now you're a jobbing actor, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
With The Father and Diplomacy, I felt like they were themes that were very dear to you. And does that help you decide what to play and what to do for yourself?
Well, actually, the Father was a bit of a gift that was just offered me by the STC out of the blue, and so
Right.
I happily accepted that. Diplomacy, if you remember, I brought that to you because I'd got hold of the script. Someone had sent it to me, and I said, "Do you like the look of this?" And you were very happy to go along with it. It just appealed to me very much because I thought, here's a great vehicle for two old ham actors, you know. And John Gayden and I have been on stage since we were 18 together at Sydney University, and we've done lots of things since. And I thought, my gosh, this would be a great role for Gayden to play. And I'd have such fun playing opposite him. And it's a neat little play, a great story. And I thought to do it in that space, the ensemble space, it'd be so intimate and so up close, it'd be fantastic. I wouldn't want to do it in a very large theatre because it's just the two actors for most of the play in this conversation. And I thought that's the ideal space, and it's the ideal kind of audience who knows this story, would be interested in hearing this story again. I just thought it was a very neat fit, and it seemed to have paid off.
Absolutely, yes, it was wonderful. And visiting it twice too, it was really interesting to have that advantage to be able to do it again.
Yes, that was good to bring it back, and we also, as you remember, took it on tour, and that's where we came a bit unstuck because we were in some very large spaces on tour, vast auditoriums, and that was tricky to try and retain that intimacy and that conversational tone, even though we were microphoned and we were playing in very large spaces. I must prefer, I must say, being at the ensemble. That would be the ideal place, is the ideal place to do a play like that, I think.
The intimate conversation was a huge, as you say, part of the play, and that worked so well. And a fantastic story too, amazing story.
Great story.
Yes. Now, also talking about great stories, you're coming up, hopefully, at the end of the year to do Scrooge in A Christmas Carol, which is one of my favourite. I read it every year, if I can read it every year, or even just dip into it. It seems like a silly question, but why A Christmas Carol and why Scrooge?
Well, for one thing, the role of Scrooge appeals very strongly. There aren't that many parts left when you're hitting 80. You've got to face it. Except Hamlet, of course. You played that at 80, I believe.
That's right.
So I thought, this is a great role. I've never done this before. And again, I liked the idea of it being in a small space rather than doing a big splashy kind of musical type production. Let's do it small. I was inspired by reading Dickens' life that he was a great performer, of course. He performed his own one-man show all around the world, reading from his works, and they were hugely successful. He was a passionate actor and apparently overwhelmingly powerful on stage. But also he put on plays in his own house in London with all the family and invite actor friends in. And he took it all terribly seriously. He employed friends, artists from the Royal Academy to paint the sets and the best costume makers in London to build the costumes. He even knocked out a wall of his house to accommodate one of the sets. He was that serious about it. So I thought, well, let's do Christmas Carol as if Dickens was doing it at home in his lounge room. Let's make it small and intimate and, it's that sort of feel. It's homemade theatre. And there's actually a family of actors in Nicholas Nickleby called the Crummles family, the father and mother and the kids who tour around the country. And I thought, let's combine the Crummles and the Dickenses as that sort of family who, keep changing hats and changing costumes and playing all the roles. A bit of a sing-along with the audience, maybe, a bit of Victoriana, a bit of pantomime, but basically homely. And with my daughter, Hilary, has written songs. She's done the adaptation and she's writing songs as well. So it will have a little bit of sense of music hall, pantomime, Victoriana, but very edgy about the central message, about selfishness and generosity and, someone who's never known love or been loved has to discover how to love humanity. And that's, again, very, very pertinent right now. I think there couldn't be a more important message to be broadcasting than helping each other, assisting each other, opening our hearts, being generous, because that's the only way we're going to get through this current crisis.
Indeed, it's almost like the Christmas carols. We're all coming out of a nightmare of Scrooge's, and waking up. Well, hopefully waking up to we all hope for a better world, and to take with this terrible pandemic and the awfulness of it. But we hope there'll be lessons to be learned for it at the end.
Yeah.
Indeed. I'm really looking forward to Christmas Carol. It's one of my favourites, as I say. And I went to I hadn't realised I hadn't read Nicholas Nickleby until you mentioned the Crummles, and I thought, I haven't read that. I've read most of them, so I finished reading that. It was fantastic. And they're what a fantastic family as well. Brilliant characters. And you can tell based on his love of theatre and performance, because that's all there in those descriptions of joining that family of travellers.
Yes, they are the ideal theatrical family, aren't they? Very lovable and very, able to face all sorts of crises and complications with a smile. The show must go on, and
yes.
I believe it's an actor's life for me. It's all in there.
Yeah, it's all
terrific bunch of characters.
Yes, brilliant. John, thank you so much for taking time this morning to talk to us. It's been wonderful to talk to you, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you in a foyer soon and in a theatre soon too, and hopefully we'll be doing a Christmas Carol at the end of the year, because that would be a real treat. So Thank you again for your time and for your conversation.
Not at all. It's good to see your face, even if it's only on a screen. I look forward to, if not at least rubbing elbows down the track a little bit.
Indeed, with elbow and fist bump.
Just all your subscribers and supporters. They're a wonderful support system you've got there.
Thank you, John. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mark.
Speak to you soon. Bye. That was John Bell. Wonderful to talk to John. Next week, we'll be talking to Hugh Higginson and Hannah Waterman, who are our special guests, and I'm really looking forward to that. So thank you for joining me this morning. Thank you again for your donations and your support, and thank you for your emails and your feedback. It's great to know that you're out there, and we hope that we'll see you in here in the theatre space very soon. See you. Bye.